Hello and welcome back to Speed Demon Painting. In today's video we're giving you an overview of all the different faction playstyles that you can find in Armoured Clash. 2025 was a very big year for the game because all 8 initial boxes were released for every faction. Those are the faction battle group sets, and inside you will find a complete army to start playing with, quite often clocking in at 2000 points, so you can get knee deep into the game straight away. And because these boxes are the ideal starting point to get into the full-size game, I'm basing this video on the playstyles based on what you can find inside each of these boxes. That's not to say that they are necessarily limited to that playstyle, but it is what you will find inside of that one-player starter set. So if this video was exactly what you were looking for, make sure you give it a thumbs up. That always helps others to find it as well. Now, in its core, Armoured Clash is a Victorian sci-fi game slash alternate universe slash what if sort of setting, pulp setting, but that doesn't mean that every faction relies on these sort of fantasy elements quite as much. Some do rely on it very heavily, like the Enlightened and the Sultanate, but some of the other factions are kind of rooted in what I would like to call real-world strategy. For instance, the Imperium and Union are two factions that rely on fast motorized fights to sort of get their units in position very quickly, while the Crown sort of relies on heavy artillery bombardments, while the Empire is known for its infantry waves. The Commonwealth and the Alliance rely on a mechanic that isn't quite there in our world yet, and which is sort of a deep striking mechanic. The Commonwealth does this by going underground through tunneling mechanisms, and the Alliance has these sort of drop pods with which they deploy their most elite units, the French Legionnaires. And on the other end of the spectrum you've got the Enlightened, who rely on these sort of weird death ray weapons to lay complete waste to the enemy, and the Sultanate, who rely on these sort of interdimensional portals to ferry their troops quickly across the battlefield. Now, let us start off with the Imperium. I'm trying to go over the strengths and the weaknesses that every faction has. Now, the Imperium strength definitely is that they have very strong elite units. They excel at what they do, and if you use them correctly, they'll do a massive amount of damage. They've got a very aggressive playstyle, where they rely heavily on mechanized units and fast-moving bikes to get into position and just shoot before they get killed in return. They also have some very decent armored units with some good damage output, meaning that you can build a reliable but slower center line as well, and they can cause a lot of spike damage because they've got a mechanism called Arc, which allows you to score extra heroic strikes. And it all sounds very good, but they do have some major downsides. They have very limited access to long-range firepower, with only one artillery unit that isn't really specialized in tackling either armor or infantry, so yeah, don't expect to just hang back and bombard your enemy at range. That's not how they work. Aircraft are only very suited against armor or flyers. They're quite weak if you have to use them against infantry, and they're actually one of the few ways you can reach the backline of your opponent easily, so you are probably going to have to take them in this sort of Imperium faction box. And they have a high points cost for their units, combined with high discipline, but also high break limits, which sort of represents the German discipline of knowing when enough is enough, and when casualties start becoming excessive, they will retreat from the battlefield. Now, the other highly mobile force is the Union. They also have a lot of transports and trains, along with some very decent tanks with turrets, allowing them for greater flexibility when it comes to maneuvering compared to the Prussians. They also sort of get to this blitzkrieg in a very different way than the Prussians do. These Union have a very strong combined arms playstyle, where they have a lot of smaller units that can chain activate together, sort of tackle opposing threats and get to a lot of damage in your activation in a different way. And thanks to their Give 'em Hell ability, they can deliver a lot of firepower on demand, but they're sort of left weaker afterwards, and you're going to have to rely on rallying your troops more so than, for instance, the Prussians do. It very much is a faction for aggressive players as well, because, yeah, its fortune favors the bold with this. They also have a lot of cavalry options thanks to their jet bikes, so yeah, that just emphasizes their fast, maneuverable nature. One downside that they do have compared to the Prussians is that they lack single high-power behemoths. They rely on these land trains, which have a very fun chain activation mechanic, but if you want that lots of punch in one go, you're sort of lacking for a unit option like that in this first box. The aircraft as well are only really good against infantry, so if you want to tackle armor at range, you're going to have to rely on some of your artillery, and whilst not being bad, it's not exactly the most amazing artillery at long range. Some other factions just do that way better. And speaking of the faction that does that way better, we're talking about the Crown. These guys are amazing at long range firepower. They're very good if you're sort of more for the defensive style player who likes to hang back and pepper your opponent before moving in for the kill. They can also score using any of their armored units thanks to a specialized battle group, which gives them amazing list building flexibility, and this is the ideal faction if you're sort of a threadhead who likes to rely more on their tanks rather than infantry. And thanks to their lion-hearted rule, they also have some amazing discipline. It's about as reliable as you can get because they will not buckle under pressure at the most inopportune moment. If you play your cards right, literally, you can just have them in the fight without caring too much about casualties. Now, of course, they also have quite a bit of downsides. They're not very fast and mobile, and that means that if you want to surprise your opponent through some surprise tactics, well, this is perhaps not the faction for you, because you can see them coming from a mile away, but good luck stopping them. Also, they have some very costly and vulnerable infantry, because they are quite elite and quite good at what they do, but when they're caught out in the open, you do have to be very careful with them, or you will find yourself without infantry to score very, very quickly, and then you're going to have to rely on your armor, which can actually falter. And going from the list with the limited infantry, we can go to the list with infantry aplenty, which is the Empire. If you want to play infantry waves, this really is the nation that you should get. They have some very strong long-range options as well, especially with their Jezzails, and their Fangun median tanks have some of the longest range in the game, 30-inch in fact, if my memory serves me correctly. This all leads to a very durable force because even their behemoths spread an aura around that increases the overall survivability of the units around them. Now, their initial box has no transport capability whatsoever, so this is a very slow moving force. You're going to have to advance cautiously behind your shields and just take a few hits with some of your infantry before you can start returning fire. They also have very few ways to surprise your opponent because of this, and despite having really good range, their armor units aren't exactly the most durable, so you're going to have to sort of engage more in a skirmish fight with opposing armor rather than facing them head on. Next up in the sort of medium sci-fi category, we have the Commonwealth next, who relies on tunneling units to push up the board. You can see some of them depicted in the pictures on the right hand side, and they can create a very tough wall of tanks with infantry and field guns behind them to sort of hold the line until those tunneling units come into play. They can also disrupt enemy plans very, very well by actually digging underneath them, so definitely a force that you can keep your opponent on his toes, and there's nothing quite like having to face a bunch of berserkers charging into your sort of weaker backlines suddenly, and that is something that the Commonwealth can definitely do. And their main weakness actually is their tunneling ability as well, because it's a very tricky balance to strike between what you keep in reserve and what you have on the board to start out with. If you sort of overdo it too much with the fantasy elements, you're going to find yourself facing against a numerically superior force, and you might have lost the battle because of that, because you have to rely on something that's probably going to take a turn or two to get there. And while their tanks are very tough and sort of durable for the amount of points that you pay for them, they are very difficult to maneuver because they suffer from the ponderous rule, which means that they have to use the turn template even on their regular armor. So yeah, make sure that you keep your line tight so that you don't get outmaneuvered by your opponent, because that can spell doom for this less nimble faction. The other nation that sort of relies on tricky reserve play is the Alliance. It's a very hard-hitting force that can do a lot of damage once it does arrive, and they have some very elite but specialized units, alongside a lot of cheap chaff units as well for their infantry. They can deep strike into enemy territory using their drop pods and deploying their elite French soldiers, the legionnaires, while their more readily available Brazilian and Susa units sort of hold the main main battle line. This force probably does require a bit more finesse from the player because they can pull off some surprising chain activations through a fate mechanic where if one unit starts falling back or fails a discipline test, the next one can activate and so on, but that is not exactly the most straightforward mechanism to use, so it's more for experienced wargamers. Their durability generally also isn't very stellar, so it is more what we describe as a very glass cannon type of playstyle. They also have no real tough main battle tanks. Their little charrettes are actually cavalry, which does allow them to score, which is a plus side, but they are very vulnerable to anti-tank firepower, so don't just dump them in the center and expect them to survive very long. And then for the very high sci-fi setting, we've got the Enlightened. It's the perfect faction if you enjoy hard-hitting, but somewhat swingy weapons. They can do a lot of damage in one go to multiple units, but yeah, it does come with the risk of it blowing up. They can also do very cool movement tricks to their stilted tripods and quadruped mechs that can actually move over enemy units if they want to. And they also have some devastating attacks through death beams that follow up, so you can do some very cool gameplay with them. They also have some cheap infantry with heavier and faster infantry mixed in for a very healthy mix of units with this faction. There are some downsides to having this highly experimental weapon force, though. Sometimes you will have those games where the dice and cards just betray you and you will not get a lot of output and take a lot of damage in return because, well, that's just what's happening with your guns. You have to be able to sort of, stand that as a player. They're also quite costly given their toughness as well, so yeah, you pay a lot for big brave weapons but not so much for toughness, and they don't exactly have the longest range, quite the opposite. Even their artillery is relatively short ranged compared to other factions. And then finally we have the Sultanate, and one sentence to describe them is basically fun with portals. They are a highly mobile force, sort of able to attack from unexpected angles thanks to their portal mechanisms. They also have some super elite infantry, in fact the strongest that the game has to offer, who are very good at what they do. And they've got a very cool mix of esoteric sort of portal weapons and classic guns as well, so yeah, you can find a very fun mix of those two in this force. And whilst their infantry might be very tough, very long ranged and able to sort of stay out of a fight for a while that they cannot win, their armor units definitely are not. They've got some very fragile armor units, and this faction in general is going to have a very hard time in an honest fight where two battle lines are just duking it out in the center. That does mean that this faction has a high skill floor for beginning wargamers, but veteran wargamers are definitely going to find ways to strike at that weak underbelly of most other factions and sort of come out on top because, well, they like to fight dirty. And there we have it. That was sort of the overview of what you can expect from all the different faction starter set that the game has on offer now. If you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, that always helps with the YouTube algorithm, and if you're looking for more dystopian age content, definitely subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, bye!